Hello, AI Dan here again. Just a quick one to say that we had some delay on the connection whilst talking to our guest for this episode. So at times it sounds like real life Dan is a pretty rude host where conversation overlaps. We've done our best to smooth out the delays, so bear with us as you won't want to miss this episode. You also don't want to miss out on the Turn 2 app, our sponsors for today's episode. Turn 2 is a new app for people with ME and long COVID. The app provides bite-sized drops of information on new research and findings related to our condition. I really like the interactive nature of the app, whereby you can make your own posts and questions for others to respond to, and the app is tailored to your needs. The app is free, and if you use the link in the episode description, will benefit as a podcast, and you'll be helping to cover our costs. So why not download Turn 2 today and get ready for your daily drop of digestible ME and long COVID information and engagement.
Hello and welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise Podcast, a podcast about living with ME and chronic illness, creativity and making meaning. We're joined today, Dove's here, and we're joined with by Catherine Hale. Catherine has lived with ME since 1988. She founded the chronic. I'm getting my words mixed up today. I'm sorry, people, if we're struggling a bit. She founded the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project in 2017 and led it until 2022 in the UK. She currently works part-time as a researcher on issues of disability and employment, and she has 2 teenage daughters. And I think we've been sort of planning this for a very long time, Catherine, since the start of the podcast. You were on my sort of list of people that I thought would be brilliant to talk to. So so thanks. We've actually sort of finally got here. So it's been for various different reasons. It's been good, and we've both
differently.
Yeah, and we've both been having GCSE results this week as well, haven't we? So it's been a busy week.
Gosh.
So
yesterday.
So,
both got daughters the same age.
Yes. So it's been milestone times, isn't it? So would you like to tell us a bit about your own chronic illness story before we kind of get into the other bits and bobs? Because it'd be good to kind of hear your story.
Yeah, sure. I guess so my unconventional sense, my chronic illness story started when I was 18. I was training full-time to be a professional dancer. I developed ME. I kind of tend to skim over this bit quite briefly. I was quite unwell for a couple of years and then made quite a good recovery. Wasn't able to continue with a dance career, but did go to university, and it was sort of halfway through my university degree that I recovered, say, 80 to 90% initially, and then kind of went downhill again, became very, very ill, and actually had that kind of second phase of it that was much, much worse than the first phase. So this was going back, took me to age 23 by this time. I had a spell of very severe ME where, I couldn't support the weight of my head. I couldn't feed myself. I couldn't even listen to the radio. Had to be spoon fed. I'm, mentioning that just because it's been in the media recently about the, nutritional challenges. And so, I have been sort of thinking back to that time and some of those things that I went through. But I guess all that happened such a long time ago now. That was back in the mid-90s that I don't tend to dwell on. I suppose my chronic illness sort of story now is more about where I am in my life now and, and how I see... sorry, I've got down my train of thought, but I guess that story of loss and adjustment and grief that is like everybody's chronic illness story happened to me such a long time ago that I no longer really connect with that grief and that identity. I suppose because it's been such a long time, I see myself as disabled more than chronically ill. And I've had this condition for 2/3 of my life now coming up. So I barely remember a time before it, but what I do sort of feel in the here and now is more to do the kind of grief and the processing that I'm still doing, is around what's been taken from me more recently in terms of being a parent, and, thinking back to my girls are almost grown up now, but, I'm processing their kind of early years and how much I missed out of, being their mum and all the things I couldn't do with them, but also looking forward now that I'm in my 50s, it's dawning on me that those expectations that people have at my age, that they're going to move into this retirement period where you expect to have, say, 10 or 20 years of good health, of, active retirement. And I've got parents and family members of that, now in their late 80s, who've had this kind of long, happy, active retirement, but are now obviously, in their late 80s getting some health issues, but they've had a good innings, and I just realised that despite their health issues that they're having at the moment, they still have tons more stamina and energy than I do now. And so that sort of, I'm realising that my life in the future is going to be very likely cut short because I'm already quite a bit more, restricted in what I can do than people are who are healthy in their late 80s. So yeah, I guess that question, my chronic illness story, this is where I'm at now with it. It's, it never finishes. You never finish processing, I think, chronic illness, because there's no map ahead of you when if you have a condition like ME, there's no map for what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So, you get to these points in your life and you think, oh, okay, so this is what my illness now means that, for this time in my life or for the rest of my life. So yes, that's what I wanted to say in answer to that one, really.
Yeah. It is just the passing of time is like it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because you sort of looking back and then you're looking forwards, and then like I find myself always kind of like reevaluating things like that as well. So what does when you say sort of like your
Yeah.
stories around managing chronic illness now, what does a day in the life for you look like at the minute?
Yeah, so I guess very different to the first half of my life with chronic illness, which was, through my 20s, and was a very, very, it was like life went on around me, but my life stopped. And so my life felt very, very empty, very, very still, or like I was kind of watching life go by on the sidelines. And there was this sort of aching kind of emptiness and yearning really to be part of life and to have a life, but being too unwell to, having to give up education, not being able to work. Whereas now, I took this kind of crazy, miraculous leap of having two children during having ME. And then once they were in school, I did have a sort of better ME patch around a time that made me think, okay, I can do this now. If I can, if I can be a parent, I can take on a job. I'd always wanted to work basically. And I had this brief window of time around during and just after the pregnancies where, I was weller than I'd been since my, early 20s, and did start to sort of look at how I could get into work. And so I have followed that path. I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and I'm sort of unemployable by most people's standards of employment, but I do currently work around 16 hours a week. So my life is, a day in my life is just really, really full of getting through the day with work, worrying about my children, so in that sense, it's really, really full, and there isn't that emptiness and that yearning that I had for so many years. But, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't have more on my plate than I can really manage. And there isn't a day that goes by where I'm not kind of meticulously pacing and calculating how much energy I've got to put here and there, allocating it to different places, saving it, rationing it, and then adjusting to all the kind of, the onslaught of symptoms that can come out of nowhere. That's just so second nature to me that it's part of every single day to an extent where I barely think about it anymore. So sometimes I just stop and look at other people that don't have that. I think, gosh, what must it be like to get through a day where you're not constantly having this train of thought that's about, rationing out that, carefully managing that energy envelope, and trading off, okay, I was
Energy
going to do
envelope.
that, but now
Yeah.
I've done that, so I don't have the energy to do that, so instead I'm going to do that. And it's just like, I guess I'm so used to it. But yeah, that is a day in my life. On the one hand, it looks a lot like a normal person in the sense that I've got children and work, but it's very, very different. It's very much more confined. I'm not completely housebound, but I am, to quite a large extent, confined to the home. So yeah, I'm lucky, in a lot of ways.
Do you like how is it for you in terms of like managing work? Because a lot of us can't work, or like sort of Dove and I do
Yeah,
podcast stuff because for us it's, I mean, it'd be nice to be paid for it, but it's flexible for me when I'm kind of doing things with the podcast. So sometimes I'll plan a bit and
yeah,
then I'll lie in bed for the rest of the day, or we'll do a podcast and then we'll lie in bed for the rest of the day. So like, are your employers
yeah,
quite understanding of like the impact of ME on you?
completely. Yeah, no, completely. So the closest thing I've had to a proper job was for Astrid Charity, which was, everyone working there, almost everyone working there had a chronic illness. We all worked from home. We all worked very part-time. So it was just common knowledge that this is the way we all worked. Nobody worked more than, I think, 15 hours a week, really. And we all just spread our hours out whenever we could, took rest breaks. The work I do at the moment is kind of contractual research work, so it does lend itself to, and the people I'm working with and for are completely, I'm very, very lucky. They're academics who work in this area of kind of disability and work, and completely understand, how I need, that this is the way I need to work. And so I'm very lucky with the role I've got at the moment. It's the hours that I can work, and I have so much flexibility about when I do the work in the week. Nobody's kind of clocking my hours or anything. But I mean, there's still a pressure. Obviously, there are kind of outputs that need to be achieved in a certain time frame. But I have complete autonomy about how I do that. So I'm very, very lucky. And in fact, I'm trying to advocate for more people to have opportunities to work in that way. It's so rare to have an opportunity to work in that way that we need to work. So yeah.
And I think many of us could work if there was the sort of jobs that were that flexible and not the demands, and that we could sort of manage our time in a way that there's not the demands. But there's just there's just very little out there, isn't there, in that sort of sort of style of work. So yeah,
Exactly, and
it
that
makes
is
it
something.
challenging.
Yeah, and I'm very aware of that, especially for working from Astrid. I heard from so many people who were in that boat where they were not completely incapable of work, but they could maybe put in 5 hours, 10 hours, but not with any kind of reliability. And so I know how much of a yearning, I know how much people in that situation want to, it's not even about the money, but, want to have some kind of slightly formalized purpose, to give life meaning. And so I'm really passionate about trying to create more of those kind of opportunities for people, whether they're paid or unpaid. That's not, for us, I think that's not really what it's about. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
all
go on.
the things, like when you don't, like, work is not just about sort of clocking in and making money for a lot of people. It's about community connections, a sense of purpose, a feeling of
Yeah,
belonging. Like, there's so many
exactly.
layers.
So I
Definitely.
mean
Exactly.
that maybe sort of rolls us on nicely to the next question, which was around the chronic illness inclusion project, and yeah, how did that come about, and sort of what was it, and what happened to it? And yeah, it's certainly, it's something I was aware of, and I think did I even write a guest blog or something for you at some point going back a few years? And I think, yeah, it was something that
You
that
did.
felt like a really positive thing. And was that something that you was part of, that you kind of I'm losing my words now. Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, okay. The story of that is so there's two strands, I think. One strand of it is that after about 20 years of, having ME and going through this cycle that I've been through, sort of improvement and then relapse and then improve, just sort of, for me, it's been this ongoing cycle of relapse and remission, really. And after about 20 years, it hit me that I wasn't probably going to recover. Whereas up till then, every time I had the improvement, I was like, this is it. This is the recovery. And it just sort of like Groundhog Day finally. And that was the point at which I flipped from sort of being driven by hope for recovery and waiting for recovery to going, okay, I need to make life better. I can't change my body. I can't keep waiting for recovery. I need to, my direction needs to be about trying to change the world around me so that life within my limitations is better than it is now. And so that's what kind of brought me into thinking around I guess that's what the social model of disability is, isn't it? And so I became really, really interested in pursuing that, and also in trying to connect with other disabled people with other conditions, having been so excluded and so isolated for so long in my life. I wanted to understand how that felt like, maybe with other impairments or other disabilities. And so I went looking for this kind of disability community, but it was really, really hard to connect with, because at that time, I suppose I'm talking about, I think things have changed a lot. There's much more with internet and social media, there's much more cross-fertilization of different aspects of the disability movement with the chronic illness movement. But at the time that I was doing this exploration, the only places you could connect with the disability movement or community in the UK was in physical spaces like local organisations or national organisations. But it was all about being able to get to those spaces, and being housebound or, virtually housebound meant that I just couldn't be in those spaces. So, that's when I started to grapple with like, well, even trying to convey that you're housebound within certain sections of the disability rights community is very, very difficult. There's for understandable reasons, there's a big sort of pushback against the concept of saying that you're housebound or bedbound. And so it was almost like there's this movement out there that I'm excited by and I want to connect with, but I don't feel like the leaders of that movement really understand that we're here. Those of us with chronic illness are here in our homes and our beds, and we might want to connect, but we can't connect with it unless they can sort of understand and perceive that we are housebound. And that's a very, very difficult concept to get across. So, yeah, so there was one strand of it was, me exploring the social model of disability and chronic illness communities kind of pushback against it and reaction to it. That was kind of, talked about on blogs and social media at the time. And I felt like we were talking past each other, like the chronic illness community and the disability rights movement were kind of talking past each other and not understanding each other. And I wanted to kind of build understanding on both sides. So that was one part of it. And another part of it was that I was doing policy research, kind of campaigning research with an organisation called Mind, a big mental health charity. And we were looking at the impact of welfare reforms that we have in the UK. So kind of like conditionality around benefits, which was a new thing back in the 2012, that was having an awful impact both on the chronic illness community, but also on the mental health community, like really, really terrible. So I was involved in this campaigning research, and some of that was around, trying to take this message to policymakers and government to try and create change. And that made me aware of how kind of representation, lobbying and influencing was working in terms of trying to speak to people in government, trying to raise awareness of how detrimental and damaging these policies were. I became aware that there were there's Mind representing people with mental health, huge, big charity. There's big charities, people with Scope. Sorry, my brain's gone. I can't remember all the names, but there were these big campaigning charities representing different groups of disabled people. So like National
Like
Autistic
Cancer
Society,
Research
RNIB,
UK,
National, for visual impairment. And I realised that there was nobody representing people like me, people with chronic illness, and there were actually a lot of us who couldn't work because of chronic illness, pain and fatigue, but we had no voice. There's nobody, no big charity. There were small medical charities like Action for ME or whatever, but they, compared to these big charities, had no resources to do this kind of policy work, like social policy work. So I became aware of this huge gap in representation, which meant that those of us who were saying we're too ill to work, or, who tend to identify as sick rather than disabled, were just in our own echo chambers on social media, talking amongst ourselves and not, trying to explain that we're too ill to work. And this message was just, we're just hitting a brick wall, really. Even disability rights charities were not taking on that message. We were saying, what do you mean? No, everybody can work. All disabled people can work. And so at the time there was like, this real kind of really, really difficult messaging going on. And I got this opportunity, this research grant came out called Drill, that was funded by disability charities. I had some connections with disability organisations by that point, and it was very, very unusually didn't require you to have a PhD. And so I just naively wrote this funding application for, this vision I had of creating a bridge between the chronic illness community and the disability rights movement, kind of amplifying the voice of the chronic illness community so that we had more influence and, could challenge harmful policies. And people told me, oh, you'll never get it because, you don't have a PhD. You need to be doing this with a university. And I thought they're probably right. But, and yeah, to my huge surprise, they awarded me, I think they liked the idea of, trying to, build kind of representation for people who who often don't even identify as disabled. But I think, there was an awareness that there are a lot of people who are disabled in the legal sense of the Equality Act, who don't identify as disabled, who are not part of the disability rights movement and who are not being represented. So I think I just sort of presented this idea and it, it landed. So what it was, well, it was a very big thing. It was a 3-year research project that then, it was so obvious early on that there was so much, policy work that could be done with all the research and the data we found in terms of challenging, especially welfare benefits policy, disability benefits policy, but also social care. There were so many kind of social policy areas that it touched on, and so it built such momentum. Really, there was a really huge following, and there was a real sense that people wanted it. People felt represented by it and wanted this kind of advocacy platform to continue. And I just kind of kept going with the momentum even after the funding ran out. And so, and lots of people came along and got involved. And so, it grew into an advocacy organization, or we called it a disabled people's organization. So we kind of structured it with a governance structure. But it was clear it just couldn't keep going, being run by people with chronic illness. I think almost every advocacy effort or organization that has solely relied on people volunteering with chronic illness has, invariably burnt out. People join, they have some enthusiasm, they tend to overdo it, they burn out, they leave. And so there was a time when I had a big hope because Disability Rights UK, which is our kind of leading disability rights organisation in the UK, was one of the sponsors of this research programme. And one or two people, well, the CEO Cameron and the head of policy Fazile, really loved the work that we did and the message that we were kind of putting out there. and wanted to find a way to support chronic illness inclusion to keep going, with funding and with resources and support. And so there was a period of about a year when I was working closely with Disability Rights UK to build evidence, and with their fundraisers put in, quite major funding applications for kind of big 3-year projects that would like embed, this concept of energy limiting conditions that came out of it. That, they really got that message that this was a constituency of disabled people who are not being represented currently. And there's a lot of work to do with government, with policymakers, with, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in terms of law. There's a big, ambitious idea for how to continue this work and how to kind of continue influencing decision makers to see chronic illness or energy limiting conditions as a very common type of disability that's not currently being accounted for, or there are no specific policies tailored for it, and there's this huge lack of understanding. So we worked really hard in putting together these funding bids to big funders, and with DR UK's professional fundraisers, and each of them just fell flat. It was really, really soul destroying, because these big funders, it made me realise how little understanding they have of disability in the first place. They didn't understand what we were trying to do. They thought we were trying to do some kind of health work, because we mentioned long COVID, that there's a growing population of people becoming newly disabled with long COVID, which is an energy limiting condition. And they were like, oh no, you don't meet our funding criteria because you're doing health work. We're like, okay. So anyway, these funding applications didn't come off, and I had been just massively overworking myself for no money for quite a long time, and trying to juggle directing the organisation, doing the research and doing the policy work and doing the communications work, leading on all of those. And it was just completely unsustainable for me, with, as someone with a chronic illness, to, and much as there were people volunteering and wanting to get involved and wanting to help, but, it needed to sort of go to the next level of being a funded organisation with, paid posts of people who could reliably, be asked to take on aspects of the work. And so I took a really difficult, it just occurred to me one day that I was just breaking myself, and that the only way I could stop breaking myself was just to walk away. So it was really, really difficult, but it just got to a point where I had to walk away from it. So that's the story of chronic illness inclusion. Yeah. So there's a lot of work left undone from it.
There is a bit of a legacy
I wanted to do.
So I'm just aware we've got a bit of a delay, but I don't know. I was to say that there is like a legacy there, isn't there, to some extent, in terms of some of the things that have come out of it, and particularly the term energy limiting condition is something that seems to get used more now, or we see it around. And sort of, was that something that's quite important in terms of having that as an umbrella term for lots of different conditions, where, I mean, obviously ME is very significant within that, in terms of what we all experience, but other conditions as well that kind of come under that, there needs to be a sense of actually people grasping, and within medicine grasping the post-exertional malaise element of our conditions and how that impacts. And it's is that something you feel quite proud of, that's something that kind of a term that came out of that?
Yeah. And funny enough, I think that is the biggest legacy of it. And I'm currently in the process of writing a journal article, my first peer-reviewed journal article for a disability studies journal. It's sort of almost there, about this term and how it came out of the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project and why it's important. So I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and it did really emerge from the research process. It was a very kind of, we had this online quality forum for the research that went on for 8 weeks, and it was people like in a Facebook group, really kind of talking, not just answering a researcher's questions, but talking amongst themselves. And 20 people in the group, and they quickly kind of took hold of the research agenda, which had started out being quite formalized, like what are the social barriers you face? And very quickly they kind of like hijacked the agenda, and it became about, we deliberately selected people with quite a broad range of conditions because we knew that otherwise it would be, largely people with ME. This was back in 2018. And we wanted to kind of say this is broader than one condition. This is, chronic illness is an experience, and so, something that's broader than one condition. So it became very clear that all these people with quite different conditions, respiratory, kidney, liver, EDS, fibromyalgia, neurological, what they all had in common was, fatigue being the most debilitating aspect of their condition, but also the most misunderstood, dismissed, trivialized, so this feeling of, I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to identify as disabled because, this very disabling, debilitating experience that I have is not thought of as a disability. It's thought of something that, everyone gets tired, kind of like a universal experience. And so the agenda for them became about developing a better language than fatigue. Fatigue sort of, not liked by anybody. Developing a concept or a term that would help them to convey, whether it's to family, friends, or disability assessors or policymakers, to convey, both what they're kind of, in sort of academic terms, it's called impairment effects. I'm sort of, part of me's in this disability studies theory, and we talk about impairment effects being the, the effect of your condition, whatever that is, that a concept that explains that impairment effect better than fatigue. Something like spoon theory, but spoon theory takes quite a while to explain. The metaphor of spoons and limited energy is not an obvious one, so it doesn't kind of meet the sort of elevator test, does it, of explaining something quickly. So a sort of quick shorthand way of explaining to people around them both what their experience was, but also what their needs, and what kind of adjustments they might need. And I think we were all aware that the term chronic illness is just doesn't really elicit that kind of, the best response you get if you tell someone you've got chronic illness is like, oh, poor you, kind of thing. There, you don't have to do this, go and rest. Whereas what we often want is actually, well, actually, I do want to do this, but I need you to adapt it in such a way that, I can take part at different times. I can take part from home. I can pace myself. Yeah, I need you to understand I might not be able to make it on a certain time or a certain day. And so that the concept of energy limiting conditions was really to define a type of disability in a way that would make it equivalent to a mobility impairment, a visual impairment, a learning disability, those other kind of broad groups of disability that people can grasp and understand. Okay, if you've got mobility, if you're a wheelchair user, I need to have, put a ramp in place, or, it was a way of trying to define ourselves as a kind of group within the disability umbrella that, and in a way that both conveys what your experience is, but also what your kind of adjustment or accommodation or support needs might be, and in a way that doesn't depend on having a medical diagnosis. It's a label that can be used whether you have whatever your diagnosis is. I've never wanted to, some people have said, but what's the list of energy limiting conditions? We need a definite list. And I'm like, well, there are some really, like, the most obvious classic ones are ME and long COVID, aren't they? But then there are where the energy impairment is the core feature of the condition, but then there's a whole load of other conditions where, like, say, MS or EDS or lots of conditions where people sometimes do get quite significant energy impairment, but other people may not. So where fatigue or energy impairment might be a kind of a secondary issue, or might be the main issue they experience. For some people with MS, it is the fatigue that, I keep saying fatigue, the energy impairment that disables them more than anything else. And that's quite common in a lot of conditions. And that's often the thing that doctors dismiss as well. Even if you have a recognized condition like rheumatoid arthritis, your doctor's interested in your inflammatory levels that can be measured in the blood, but they're not interested in, the debilitating fatigue. That means, that's the reason you have to stop work or whatever. So yeah, we kind of designed it as an umbrella term that's very, very broad, that anyone who has, like, the most basic definition of it is that you're restricted in the amount of activity you can do, whether that's mental or physical activity. Like, that's the most kind of essential, I think, way of defining it. It's not defined by your diagnosis. It's defined by having this, being restricted in the amount of activity you can do, rather than having something wrong with a particular part of your body. And I think it came about because I often find, when you have to tick a box when someone asks about your disability, and it's like, tick a box. Is it mobility? Is it cognitive? Is it, and so often ME and other conditions span all of them, don't they? But I often feel I'm not allowed to tick the cognitive impairment box because that's for people with diagnosed dementia or something. So yeah, it feels like there was a missing box where the only box you can tick is long-term health condition, which is like this kind of default sort of catch-all other kind of box. But it doesn't tell people anything about what your support needs are or what your experience is. So yeah, so I'm rambling on quite a lot. Sorry if I'm rambling too much, but
it's all right. It's all interesting.
Yeah, this is something I'm really passionate.
Did you have a question, Dove?
No, I'm just listening. I was thinking about the person who wrote Spoon Theory had lupus and kind of just thinking about just the range of illnesses that it's like I do think of other illnesses as like energy limiting, but I think it's hard to kind of describe the differences between ME and the other. It's like I think I sort of haven't done a good job of kind of thinking, it's like when you're trying to group things, you're trying to think, okay, what are things that are similar between ME and other illnesses? And I always think of the kind of catastrophic sort of, post-exertion stuff in ME as unique, but it is true that there are so many people with so many illnesses that do have a kind of energy limiting situation where you can't function. You need a lot of supports that you don't have access to, and here it's like I'm on disability, but in order to get help with like cleaning, cooking, like all of this basic stuff that a lot of us need help with, like I literally have to be able to like not feed myself. So like basically, since I can feed myself, I don't have the right to have access to any kind of help. And so I guess it just makes me think, I know we're kind of getting to this, but the question of like, what kind of supports do people need? And there's such a broad range, and there's so little access to any of them. So I was just kind of thinking about transitioning into that question, which I forget I know we were going to get to that, but
yeah.
I think what you'd jotted down earlier was social care and the Catherine's process of thinking behind the concept and what it would look like in an ideal world.
Yeah, I'll get to that. And I just wanted to pick up on something you said about that's really, really difficult, I think, for us in the ME community to grapple with. What the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project made me realise is that a lot of people with other different conditions that we had in the focus group, cystic fibrosis, COPD, kidney and liver disease, have quite a similar day-to-day experience of energy impairment in terms of having, like the Spoon Theory, having to ration limited energy, and to some extent having an experience of payback, whereby if you exceed your energy envelope, you'll pay for it the next day. And so it was like everyone in this focus group that we had, 20 people, if I hadn't known what their diagnoses were, I would have assumed they all had ME because their day-to-day life was so similar. But then the difference comes with like severe ME, and post-exertional malaise is on another, it's a whole other thing, which there's no other, no other diseases like it, except, that long COVID, obviously, which is ME, really. It is just a whole other level of, like, the payback for something so small can set you back like 2 months. That's not found in any other disease. And the thing of, not having the energy to brush your teeth or talk 5 minutes on the phone. I mean, that is, so the energy impairment with ME is on a whole other, it's off the scale compared to, I think, pretty much any other disease. And I think we know that from those quality of life sort of scores. So I think there's part of the ME community that, and it's very, very important to make that distinction understood and to explain that post-exertional malaise is not like any other kind of fatigue. But it's also the case that the fatigue and energy impairment that people with respiratory diseases, kidney diseases, and what have you, or neurological diseases have, is also misunderstood and is also of a different scale to everyday fatigue of, like, oh, I'm jet lagged, or I had a hard week at the office. So I like to, I know it's kind of quite controversial to, it's probably quite controversial to use this term energy limiting conditions such a broad way. And I think that people, like with autism or neurodiversity identify with it, and people with mental health conditions can identify with it. And I think that that's a tricky thing that we haven't, that, I'm probably going to get pushed back against, because it's like, it becomes like the term fatigue, where it becomes so vague that, anyone can have fatigue. And so it removes the distinctiveness of post-exertional malaise, which is on a whole other scale to other kinds of fatigue. But I still, and I will always say that, but I still think it's a valuable term to have. And I don't think it's right to restrict it by diagnosis and say, well, unless you have these diagnoses, you can't adopt that label. Like that's kind of really against my ethos. So it is broad, and it gets applied to mental health conditions, neurodiversity, and other disabilities. But I think that in terms of social policy, so I'm not talking about medical research and treatment, but in terms of social policy, I think it's really valuable to promote it and to build understanding of it. So onto the social care question. I really identify with that experience, that unless you have certain difficulties with feeding yourself, you're then not eligible. And that's the same in the UK. So I wrote a report with Action for ME in 2015 that found, the kind of assessment systems used in social care and the kind of rationing and cuts that have happened in the UK. I don't know about in the States, but, I think social care packages were more available for people with ME for things like, cleaning and cooking and shopping in the past. I had one myself in the 90s, because all disabled people's social care packages have got cut, so that, cut back to the very, what they call the most urgent, or, the most disabled. And so that's measured by criteria like, being whether you can feed yourself and go to the toilet independently, sadly. And there is no understanding, because there's no understanding of energy impairment and energy limiting conditions. There's not the understanding of that kind of trade-off that we all do with an energy limiting condition, where, you might on any one day, you may be able to either have a shower or, join in some kind of, or maybe talk to your mum on the phone for 15 minutes. You've got that tiny amount of energy, and you can either spend it on those kind of daily living activities, or on doing something that brings you meaning and purpose. And many of us, I know many people make those trade-offs where they just may not shower for several days, because, the impact of showering sort of means you can't do, a couple of other things that are really, really important to you, to sort of keep connected or keep meaning in your life. So what I would have loved to carry on doing, if we carry on advocating this space, is building understanding within social care assessments that, it's not just about being able to do that activity once or not. It's not categorical, and it's not just a fluctuating condition where you have good days and bad days, so sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. It's about this trade-off, that this really, really extreme trade-offs that we have to make, whereby if you have a shower or keep yourself clean, you then can't do so many other things with that tiny amount of energy. And so, in an ideal world, a social care package would be looking at doing those daily living activities that have to be done, but that don't bring you meaning or purpose, having those taken over for you, so that with your tiny amount of energy, you can spend it on doing something meaningful with your life. That would be the ideal scenario. And that would just mean completely overturning their understandings of how to measure disability, how to understand disability. And until that happens, I think we're just stuck with these kind of basic brute measures of like, okay, well, you can feed yourself, so you don't fall into that high need category. When actually, if you look in the round at how limited our lives are, it's not, it's limited in so many ways, that, in the whole, our lives are extremely limited, but because you're not necessarily categorically unable to feed yourself, you're not eligible. And those principles kind of run through social care, but also social security assessments. And it's just, it comes down to the, really flawed understandings of what disability is. And hope I've answered the question.
No care for quality of life. And I'm thinking about, the kind of the ways they ask questions and the ways they use categories are so unable to to even consider that, like, quality of life and sort of what it's like to have an isolating, energy limiting condition where you might not have access. It's like, you can be able to brush your teeth and not be able to go to the grocery store, but I think there's also just a failure to humanize the concept of care in any way. And there's something else. My brain is losing it, but what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that one of the big things around over here in the UK is like PIP assessments, and how I don't know anybody with ME that gets anything, or I've not come across anybody that's got anything for the cognitive impairment side of it, which is like what you were mentioning, Catherine. It's almost like, well, can you navigate from one place to another if you're out on a journey? Well, I could, but most of the time I'm not well enough to even be out on that journey. So there's a real disconnect there in terms of being kind of like prevented from even getting anywhere near that sort of side of the scale, because it's just not accepted that cognitive impairment might be a part of your condition for whatever reason. I haven't come across anybody that kind of gets pipped for the cognitive side of things with ME. So if anybody's listening and they do get it, I'd love to hear. But it's
No, you're absolutely right.
I'm just
and
aware
I've
of
had
time, and there's so many
the same
things.
experience.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I won't. I could go on and on about that exact point, but probably for another time. But you're right.
So we're sort of like, we've gone over the amount of time that we'd planned, and we always do. But it's been so good to, and like, it would be great maybe to I keep saying this every time, I'll be great to talk again, and then but maybe we need to book it in, because I think one of the things that'd be really good to talk about would be to delve more into the social model of disability, and but I'd just like to say thank you for all your work as well that you've done, and the effort you put into sort of creating the project. And it can feel frustrating when you've put so much time and energy into something, and it has come to an end. But it I guess we've got to hope that some of the things that come out of it, and your work on your research and things that you're doing, will have a lasting impact. And it's been so good to hear a little bit about the journey that you've been on as well with that, the project alongside your own kind of illness, and how you've kind of like worked hard at trying to kind of have some sort of outcome from it all. So thank you.
No,
Yeah,
thank you
thank
so much
you.
for
I
having me
wish
on and asking
I
me
would love
about
to
it.
do
Honestly, I love.
another.
Carry on, we've got a delay.
Yeah, no, I stopped because yeah, the delay is a little confusing. I was just saying that I would love to have a follow-up conversation because I think there's so much rich stuff to talk about here. And and I think one thing that's come up is just the idea of what is an illness or disability community, and how do we sort of find the things that we have in common, and how do we kind of miss each other, and I think that's sort of a bigger question, and how does is there a way that ME gets sort of forgotten even in the world of sort of um chronic illness, and why is that, why do, and this, I think this is one of the questions, like why do people have such a hard time sort of understanding that we exist?
Have you got any thoughts, Catherine, before we finish?
Yeah, those are really great. Yeah, no, those are really, really great questions that really, really chime with absolutely with, what I think about. And so I would love to talk more. And so I just want to say thank you so much for having me on and asking me about Chronic Illness Inclusion Project, because I love talking about it. And yeah, the sort of lag that there is on this thing means I feel like I've just rabbited on and on and on, and it hasn't been much of a conversation. It's been quite hard with this sort of time delay to like have an interactive discussion. But yeah, I would love to do more of that, and especially around those issues around the social model of disability. I think there's so many ways in which we talk past each other, the chronic illness and the disability rights communities. And so yeah, all those, yeah, let's do this again.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, and
Thank you.
and yeah, we'll have to maybe beginning of next year or something arrange to catch up and delve a little bit deeper. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, lovely
We'll
to chat
stop
to you
it.
both.